Texas. A state where the sun beats down mercilessly, and the wind drives dust across endless plains. Here, among luxurious ranches and modern villas, live those who have long tasted wealth and power. In one such home, surrounded by a high fence and surveillance cameras, lived the Carter family. Graham and Evelyn Carter. A couple who seemed to have it all: money, status, beauty. But behind the facade of their perfect life lay a crack that was about to shatter their world into pieces. Graham Carter, a tall, stately man of 45, was a successful oil tycoon. His name resonated in business circles, and his fortune was worth hundreds of millions. He was a man accustomed to getting what he wanted, whether it was a new oil well or the attention of a beautiful woman. His wife, Evelyn, was his complete opposite. Slender, elegant, with a cold beauty, she always kept herself composed. She was 42 but looked 35, thanks to daily workouts, expensive treatments, and impeccable style. She was not just Graham's wife. She was his partner, his support, his queen. But even queens sometimes lose their crowns. Their marriage had lasted 20 years. They had met in college, and back then, Evelyn was the only one who could resist Graham's charm. She was smart, ambitious, and independent, and that was what attracted him. They married, built an empire together, but over the years, something began to change. Graham spent more time at work, and Evelyn, alone. Their conversations grew shorter, and their glances, colder. But they continued to play their roles because it was necessary. Because it was expected. One evening, when Graham came home later than usual, Evelyn noticed that he smelled of someone else's perfume. It was a faint, barely noticeable scent, but to her, it was like a thunderclap in a clear sky. She said nothing, but a fire ignited in her eyes, one she had long suppressed. The next day, she hired a private investigator. She needed to know the truth. The truth was bitter. Graham was cheating on her with a young masseuse named Lila. The girl was only 25 and worked at an elite spa that Graham frequented after his workouts. Lila was beautiful, like a Greek goddess, with long chestnut hair, seductive curves, and an innocent gaze that, as it turned out, was just a mask. She knew Graham was married, but that didn't stop her. She wanted a taste of the life of the rich and famous, and Graham became her ticket to that world. Evelyn received photos, videos, and even recordings of their conversations. She sat in her office, surrounded by expensive trinkets and paintings they had collected together, and felt her heart turn to stone. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She just sat there, staring at the evidence of her husband's betrayal, and a plan began to form in her mind. A plan for revenge. Evelyn had always been a woman who knew how to keep herself in check. She wasn't the type to let her emotions take over. But at that moment, as she scrolled through the photos of Graham and Lila, her fingers clenched so tightly that her nails dug into her palms, leaving red crescent marks. She saw how he smiled at that girl, how his hand rested casually on her thigh, how they laughed together in a cozy restaurant he had never taken her to. She saw how Lila looked at him with adoration, as if he were her only chance at happiness. And Evelyn realized that this wasn't just an affair. This was betrayal. A betrayal of their 20-year marriage, their shared dreams, their life. She closed the laptop and slowly rose from her chair. Her office was her sanctuary, a place where she could be herself. Here, she planned her charity events, negotiated with designers and artists, and created her own world, parallel to Graham's. But now that world was crumbling. She walked to the window and looked out at the endless expanse of their ranch. The sun was setting, painting the sky in blood-red hues. It was beautiful, but Evelyn saw it only as a symbol of the end. She knew she couldn't just walk away. She couldn't let Graham and that girl destroy everything they had built. She couldn't let him walk away unscathed. She had to strike back. But not just any strike, a strike that would leave a scar on his soul forever. The first step was to gather more information. She knew Lila wasn't just some random girl. She was a predator, hunting for easy money and status. Evelyn hired another detective to learn everything about Lila, her past, her habits, her weaknesses. And soon, she got what she was looking for. Lila wasn't as clean as she seemed. She had debts, connections to shady people, and dark secrets she carefully hid. Evelyn smiled. This was exactly what she needed. Meanwhile, Graham continued to live his double life. He came home late, kissed Evelyn on the cheek, asked how her day was, and went to bed as if nothing had happened. He didn't even suspect that his wife knew about his infidelity. He thought he was smarter, that he had everything under control. But he was wrong. Evelyn began to act. She invited Lila to their house under the pretext of a charity event. The girl, of course, agreed. She thought this was her chance to enter their world, to become part of their circle. But she didn't know it was a trap. When Lila arrived, Evelyn greeted her with a smile. She was dressed in a white dress that accentuated her slender figure and looked like a true queen. Lila, on the other hand, wore a dress that was too revealing, screaming of her insecurity. Evelyn noticed how the girl fidgeted, how her eyes darted around the room as if searching for Graham. But he wasn't home. It was just the two of them. "Thank you for coming," Evelyn said, handing Lila a glass of champagne. "I've heard you give wonderful massages. I think I should try one." Lila smiled, but there was wariness in her eyes. She hadn't expected such a reception. She thought Evelyn would be cold and distant, but instead, she was friendly and charming. It threw her off. "Of course," Lila replied, accepting the glass. "I'd be happy to." Evelyn led her to the living room, where they sat on the couch. The conversation started with small talk about the weather and the latest news, but gradually, Evelyn steered it in the direction she wanted. "You know, Lila," she said, looking at the girl with her cold blue eyes, "I've always admired young women who know what they want." "You do know what you want, don't you?" Lila froze. She felt that something was off, but she couldn't quite put her finger on it. I'm just trying to live my life," she replied uncertainly. Evelyn smiled. "Live your life? Interesting. What about the lives of others? Have you ever thought about how your actions might affect them?" Lila felt her heart start to race. She realized Evelyn knew, but she didn't know how much. "I don't understand what you're talking about," she said, trying to stay calm. Evelyn slowly rose from the couch and walked over to the fireplace. She picked up a photograph of herself and Graham, happy together. It was from a long time ago, but she remembered every moment. "You know, Lila," she said, not turning around, "I've always believed that every action has consequences. And I'm sure you understand that too." Lila felt panic rising in her chest. She wanted to stand up and leave, but her legs wouldn't obey. She realized she was trapped, with no way out. Evelyn turned to her and smiled. But it wasn't a kind smile. It was the smile of a predator who knew her prey was already in her claws. "Don't worry," she said softly. "I'm not going to punish you. On the contrary, I want to give you a chance. A chance to fix your mistakes." Lila stared at her, unable to utter a word. She knew her life was about to change forever. Evelyn slowly approached Lila, her heels clicking against the floor like a metronome counting down the last seconds of calm. She stopped in front of the girl, her gaze cold but with a strange mix of anger and satisfaction. She knew she had the situation under control. "Do you think you can just walk into my life and destroy it?" Evelyn asked, her voice quiet but each word striking like a whip. "Do you think you can take my husband, my home, my life, and I'll just let you?" Lila tried to stand, but Evelyn sharply placed a hand on her shoulder, forcing her to stay seated. Her fingers dug into the girl's skin, leaving marks. I didn't mean to. Lila began, but Evelyn cut her off. Didn't mean to? Her voice grew louder, tinged with fury. Do you think your didn't mean to means anything? Do you know what I've been through to build this life? Do you know how much I've given to be with him? You're nothing. You're just a mistake I'm about to fix. Lila felt her heart racing. She realized she was trapped, with no way out. She tried to find words, but her mind was blank. Evelyn stepped away and walked over to the table where a folder of documents lay. She opened it and pulled out several sheets. Do you know you have debts, Lila? She asked, scanning the papers. Debts you can't pay. And you know what else? You have friends who aren't so friendly. They could make your life difficult. Lila felt panic rising in her chest. She knew what Evelyn was talking about. She knew her past could be her downfall. What do you want? She asked, her voice trembling. Evelyn smiled. It wasn't a kind smile. It was the smile of a predator who knew her prey was already in her claws. I want you to do something for me, she said. And if you do it, I'll take care of your debts. I might even give you some money to start a new life. But if you refuse... She paused, letting her words sink in. If you refuse, I'll destroy you. You'll never work in this city again. You'll never live a normal life. Do you understand? Lila nodded. She understood. She had no choice. Good, Evelyn said, satisfied. Then listen carefully. Evelyn began to explain her plan. She spoke calmly, but every word was calculated to the smallest detail. She knew Lila was the key to her revenge, and she intended to use her to the fullest. The plan was simple but cunning. Evelyn wanted Lila to continue seeing Graham, but now under her control. She wanted Lila to extract information from him that could ruin his reputation. She wanted Lila to make him feel the same pain, betrayal, and humiliation she had felt. You'll do everything I say, Evelyn said, staring at Lila. And if you try to warn him, if you try to deceive me, you'll regret it. Do you understand? Lila nodded. She understood. She had no choice. Evelyn smiled. She knew her plan would work. She knew Graham would fall into her trap. And she knew her revenge would be sweet. Layla left the Carter house with a heavy heart and a mind full of thoughts. She felt trapped, caught between two strong personalities, each of whom could destroy her life. But she had no choice. She had to play by Evelyn's rules if she wanted to survive. The next day, she met Graham at their usual spot, a cozy cottage on the outskirts of town that he had rented specifically for their meetings. When he saw her, his face lit up with a smile, but Layla couldn't return it. Her mind was occupied with Evelyn's plan. What's wrong, darling? Graham asked, embracing her. You look so sad. Layla forced herself to smile. Nothing, I'm just tired, she replied, trying to sound natural. Work, you know. Graham nodded, but his eyes showed concern. He knew Layla well enough to sense that something was wrong, but he decided not to press her. Instead, he offered her a glass of wine to relax. They sat down on the couch, and Layla began to execute Evelyn's plan. She started asking Graham questions about his work, his business, his partners. She did it carefully, so as not to arouse suspicion, but Graham wasn't the type to be easily fooled. Why are you suddenly so interested in my work? He asked, raising an eyebrow. You never cared before. Layla felt her heart start to beat faster. She knew she had to be careful. I just want to know more about you, she replied, trying to sound sincere. You talk so much about your business, and I want to understand what's important to you. Graham looked at her suspiciously, but then smiled. You're so sweet, he said, kissing her on the forehead. But don't worry. Everything's under control." Layla nodded, but inside she felt increasingly uneasy. She realized that Graham wasn't as simple as he seemed. And she knew that if he suspected anything, her life would turn into a nightmare. Meanwhile, Evelyn was watching everything from the sidelines. She was receiving reports from her private investigator, who was keeping an eye on Layla and Graham. She knew that Layla had started executing her plan, but she also knew that Graham wasn't the type to be easily deceived. She understood that she had to tread carefully so as not to scare him off. One evening, when Graham came home later than usual, Evelyn greeted him with a smile. She was wearing her favorite black dress, which accentuated her slender figure, and she looked like a true queen. "How was your day, darling?" she asked, handing him a glass of wine. Graham looked at her in surprise. They hadn't spoken so warmly in a long time. "It was fine," he replied, taking the glass. "And yours?" "Oh, I had an interesting day," Evelyn said, smiling. "I met with a new designer for our charity event. He's so talented." Graham nodded, but his thoughts were elsewhere. He felt that something had changed, but he couldn't quite put his finger on it. Evelyn noticed his pensiveness and decided to use it. "You know, Graham," she said, moving closer to him, "I've been wanting to talk to you about something important for a while now." Graham looked at her suspiciously. "About what?" he asked. Evelyn smiled. "About us. About our life. I feel like we've become so distant from each other. Maybe we should change something." Graham felt his heart start to beat faster. He hadn't expected this kind of conversation. "What do you mean?" he asked. Evelyn stepped even closer and placed her hand on his chest. "I mean that we should be closer. We should be a team. Like we used to be." Graham looked at her, and his eyes showed confusion. He didn't know what to say. He felt his world starting to crumble, but he couldn't understand why. Graham couldn't shake the strange feeling that something had changed. Evelyn, who had been cold and distant for the past few months, suddenly began showing him tenderness. She cooked his favorite meals, took an interest in his affairs, and even suggested they spend the weekend together at their country villa. It was so unlike her that Graham began to suspect there was something behind it. One evening, as they sat on the terrace enjoying the sunset, Graham decided to have an honest conversation with Evelyn. "Evie," he began, looking at her with his piercing eyes, "what's going on? You've been so different lately. Are you hiding something from me?" Evelyn smiled, but her smile was enigmatic. She slowly raised her glass of wine and took a sip before answering. "Why do you think that?" she asked, her voice calm but with a hint of mockery. "Maybe I just realized we should be closer. Or don't you like that?" Graham felt his heart begin to race. He knew Evelyn was up to something, but he couldn't figure out what. He decided not to press her, but inside his unease grew. "Of course, I like it," he said, trying to sound sincere. "It's just unexpected." Evelyn smiled even wider. "Sometimes change is for the better," she said, her voice soft but with a steely determination. "You like change too, don't you?" Graham felt a chill run through him. He realized Evelyn knew. She knew about Layla. But how? He had been so careful. He never left any traces. Or had he? He decided not to show his emotions. Instead, he smiled and took her hand. "You're right," he said. "Change can be for the better." Evelyn looked at him with her cold blue eyes, and there was something in her gaze that made Graham feel uneasy. She knew. She definitely knew. Meanwhile, Layla continued to carry out Evelyn's plan. She met with Graham, asked him questions, tried to extract information from him. But the more she did it, the more suspicious he became. He grew more cautious, more reserved. He stopped telling her about his affairs, stopped sharing his thoughts. Layla felt she was losing control of the situation, and it scared her. One evening, when they were at the cottage, Graham suddenly asked her, "Layla, you're keeping something from me. What's going on?" Layla felt her heart begin to race. She knew she had to be careful. "Nothing," she replied, trying to sound natural. "It's just, I have a lot on my mind." Graham looked at her suspiciously. "Are you sure?" he asked. "Because I feel like you're hiding something." Layla felt panic rising. She knew that if Graham found out the truth, her life would turn into a nightmare. She decided to steer the conversation in a different direction. "Maybe you're just being paranoid," she said, smiling. "You work too much. You need to relax." Graham looked at her, and his eyes showed confusion. He knew she was hiding something, but he couldn't figure out what. He decided not to press her, but inside his unease grew. Meanwhile, Evelyn continued with her plan. She knew Graham was starting to suspect, but that was part of her design. She wanted him to feel the same pain, betrayal, and humiliation she had felt. She wanted him to understand what it meant to lose everything. One evening, when Graham returned home, he found Evelyn sitting in the living room with a folder of documents in her hands. Her face was cold, but her eyes showed satisfaction. "What's this?" he asked, approaching her. Evelyn smiled. "This is the end, Graham," she said, her voice calm but with a steely resolve. "The end of our lies." Graham felt a chill run through him. He looked at the folder and realized it was over. Evelyn knew. She knew everything. Graham stood before Evelyn, his heart pounding wildly, thoughts racing through his mind like falling stones. He looked at the folder in her hands, and every page, every photo, every record felt like a knife plunging into his pride and reputation. He knew Evelyn wouldn't stay silent. She wasn't the type to forgive. She was the type to destroy. "Evie," he began, his voice trembling despite his efforts to stay calm. "We can talk about this. We can fix it." Evelyn slowly raised her eyes to meet his. Her gaze was as cold as ice, with not a hint of pity. "Fix it." Her voice was quiet, but every word struck like a hammer. "Do you think you can fix what you've done? Do you think you can erase betrayal as if it never happened?" Graham felt panic rising. He knew he had to say something, do something to stop her. But the words stuck in his throat. I didn't want it to end like this," he muttered, lowering his eyes. "I was stupid. I made a mistake." Evelyn smiled, but her smile was full of sarcasm. "A mistake." She slowly rose from her chair and walked toward him. "You didn't make a mistake, Graham. You knew what you were doing. You knew you were betraying me. And now you'll pay for it." Graham felt a chill run through him. He knew Evelyn wasn't joking. She always followed through on her threats. "What are you going to do?" he asked, his voice barely audible. Evelyn smiled even wider. "You'll find out soon," she said, her voice soft but laced with steely determination. "But first, I want you to feel what I felt. I want you to understand what it means to lose everything." The next day, Graham woke up to a call from his lawyer. The voice on the other end was tense. "Graham, we have a problem," the lawyer said. "Evelyn has filed for divorce. And she doesn't just want half of your fortune. She wants it all." Graham felt his heart start to race. He knew this was only the beginning. "What else?" he asked, trying to stay calm. "She leaked information about your affairs to the press," the lawyer said. "It's already in the news. Your reputation is ruined." Graham felt panic overtake him. He knew this was the end. His career, his status, his life. Everything was destroyed. He threw the phone on the bed and buried his face in his hands. He knew he had to do something, but he didn't know what. He felt trapped, with no way out. Meanwhile, Evelyn watched everything unfold from the sidelines. She sat in her office, surrounded by expensive trinkets and paintings they had collected together, and felt her heart fill with satisfaction. She knew her revenge was sweet. She knew Graham would never be able to rebuild his reputation. She knew he had lost everything. But her plan didn't end there. She wanted Graham to feel the same pain, betrayal, and humiliation she had felt. And she knew how to make it happen. She picked up the phone and dialed Layla's number. "Hello, Layla," she said, her voice soft but with steely determination. "It's time for the final step." Layla stood before Graham, her heart pounding wildly, thoughts racing through her mind like falling stones. She knew she had to do what Evelyn had told her, but she was afraid. She was afraid of Graham. She was afraid of what he might do. "Graham," she began, her voice trembling. "I need to tell you something." Graham looked at her, and his eyes showed confusion. "What?" he asked, his voice barely audible. Layla took a deep breath. I was part of the plan," she said, her voice quiet but every word striking like a hammer. "Evelyn knew about us from the beginning. She made me extract information from you. She wanted to destroy you." Graham felt a chill run through him. He knew Evelyn was strong, but he hadn't expected her to go this far. "Why?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Layla looked at him, and her eyes showed pity. "Because you betrayed her," she said. "And now you have to pay for it." Evelyn watched everything from the sidelines. She knew her plan had worked. She knew Graham would never be able to rebuild his reputation. She knew he had lost everything. But her revenge didn't end there. She wanted Graham to feel the same pain, betrayal, and humiliation she had felt. And she knew how to make it happen. She picked up the phone and dialed her lawyer's number. "It's time for the final step," she said, her voice soft but with steely determination. "Make sure he loses everything." Graham and Layla sat in the dim light of his office, surrounded by stacks of documents and laptops. They had been working all night, trying to find a weak spot in Evelyn's plan. Graham knew that if they didn't succeed, it would all be over. His reputation, his fortune, his life. Everything would be destroyed. "Here," Layla suddenly said, her voice trembling with excitement. "I found something." Evelyn transferred a large sum to her friend's account. "It was 2 months ago. Could this be related?" Graham looked at the screen and felt his heart start to race. He knew that friend. It was Sarah, Evelyn's former colleague who worked at a law firm. If Evelyn had transferred money to her, it could only mean one thing. She was paying for services. Services that could destroy him. "This could be the key," he said, his voice filled with hope. "If we can prove she used that money for bribery or blackmail, we can stop her." Layla nodded, but her face was tense. "But how do we prove it?" she asked. "Evelyn is too smart. She wouldn't leave a trail." Graham smiled, but his smile was full of determination. "She left one trail," he said. You can be our key witness." Layla felt panic rising. She knew what that meant. She would have to publicly admit her role in all of this. She would have to face Evelyn head-on. I don't know if I can," she said, her voice shaking. Graham took her hand and looked into her eyes. "You can," he said. "I'll be with you. We'll do this together." Layla took a deep breath and nodded. She knew she had no choice. She had to do it. The next day, the courtroom was tense. Graham sat at the table, his face pale but his eyes filled with determination. Evelyn sat across from him, her face cold and unreadable. She knew victory was already within her grasp. The judge began the hearing, and the lawyers started presenting their arguments. Evelyn's lawyer was confident, his words hitting like hammer blows. He presented evidence of Graham's infidelity, his financial manipulations, his connections with shady people. Every word struck Graham like a knife. But then it was Graham's turn. His lawyer called Layla to the stand. She stepped forward, her hands trembling, but she tried to appear confident. She began to tell her story, how Evelyn had forced her to spy on Graham, how she had threatened her, how she had used her to destroy him. The room fell silent. Even the judge looked intrigued. Evelyn sat motionless, but her eyes burned with fury. When Layla finished, Graham's lawyer presented the evidence of the money transfer to Sarah's account. He argued that the money had been used for bribery and blackmail. He demanded that the court investigate Evelyn's actions. Evelyn stood up. Her face was cold, but her eyes blazed with anger. "This is ridiculous," she said, her voice calm but laced with steely resolve. "You're trying to accuse me of defending myself against a man who betrayed me. You're trying to paint me as a monster, but the real monster is sitting right here." She pointed at Graham. The judge called for a recess. Graham and Layla left the courtroom, their hearts pounding like hammers. They knew the next hour would decide their fate. When the hearing resumed, the judge announced his decision. He acknowledged that Evelyn's actions were unethical but not illegal. He ruled that Graham had to pay her a significant portion of his fortune. But he also ruled that Evelyn must cease all attempts to destroy his reputation. Graham felt a wave of relief. He knew it wasn't a complete victory, but it was better than he had expected. Evelyn left the courtroom, her face cold but her eyes showing satisfaction. She knew her revenge had been sweet. She knew Graham would never be the same again. Graham and Layla left Texas. They started a new life, far from everything that reminded them of the past. They knew their path would be difficult, but they were ready for it. Evelyn remained in her home, surrounded by luxury and loneliness. She knew her revenge had been sweet, but she also knew she had paid a high price for it. She had lost not only her husband but also a part of herself. And so ended the story of betrayal and revenge. A story that left scars on the souls of everyone involved. A story that reminded everyone that even in a world of wealth and power, there is room for pain, betrayal, and loss.